I want you to picture something. A room full of men in custom suits, every one of them worth more money than most people will see across an entire lifetime, all of them watching a 6-year-old boy cut across a polished marble floor, run right past all of them, and reach out and grab the hand of the mechanic standing in the back corner. My hand. That boy's name was Noah, and I still carry the exact weight of that moment, the way you carry things that rearrange something permanent inside you. The feeling of a small hand choosing yours in a room that told it not to. The look on that child's face right before he got there, like he had been walking toward me his whole life, and finally closed the distance. I didn't know yet what any of it meant. What I did know, from the first second I looked down at him, was what I recognized in that face. Because I had been seeing it every single morning in my own house, in front of a mirror my daughter stood at without saying a word. What I can tell you right now is that 2 families came out the other side of that year, changed in ways that none of us planned for, and none of us would have been able to predict if you had asked us at the start. The woman who owned that room, Noah's mother, had spent years building a life that was controlled, sealed, and carefully positioned as far away from people like me as a person can get. She had said, out loud, to people in her life who mattered, that she would never allow herself to need a mechanic. A man who drove a truck with a cracked dashboard, a man who ate his lunch off a paper towel and went home with motor oil under his fingernails that the soap never quite got all the way out. And for a long time she was right to believe that wall would hold. But her son didn't know about the wall, and my daughter didn't either. And what the 2 of them did together, without knowing what they were doing, is the reason I'm sitting here telling you this story. If you believe that what a person is worth has nothing to do with the number in their bank account, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. We are here every single week with stories like this one, stories about dignity and family, and what happens when real life refuses to follow the plan you laid out for it. Now let me take you back to where this actually started. Not the marble hall, not the suitors in their suits, not the moment Noah ran. It started 3 weeks earlier. It started in my bathroom, with a cardboard box on a high shelf that I had told myself was protecting the person I loved most in the world, when the truth was, it was only protecting me. My name is Darius Webb. I am 40 years old, and I have been working on cars since I was 15, which means I have spent more of my life underneath them than on top of them. I work out of a garage behind my house in East Atlanta, a single car space with a poured concrete floor, a crack running from one corner to the other that I keep meaning to patch and have never gotten around to, a bare bulb on a cord that swings every time the side door opens, and a rolling tool chest with my father's name scratched into the front panel in his own handwriting. Raymond Webb. He put that there himself about a decade before he passed, and I have never once thought about painting over it. The work I do is word of mouth only. No sign on the building, no website, no business cards. The people who need what I can do find me, and the ones who don't would never have respected the work anyway. I was contracted for the Caldwell Invitational, the private collector's showcase where I first met Noah, because the host had used me twice before and trusted my hands. I wasn't anybody's first choice for that room. I was the mechanic they called in case something went wrong. Aaliyah is 7 years old. She is my daughter, and she is, without any competition that comes close, the person I love most on this earth. She has her grandmother's cheekbones and her great-aunt's laugh, which sounds like something dropped on a hardwood floor, sudden and bright and gone before you can hold on to it. She has a habit of tilting her head to the left when she's thinking hard about something, a gesture I used to think she learned from watching me, until one day I realized it was her mother's habit and always had been. I have been doing her hair since the day she came home from the hospital, which means I have spent 7 years learning on the job, watching tutorial videos on my phone on Sunday nights with the volume down so she wouldn't hear me messing up, asking Ms. Everett next door to show me how to part a section clean and keep it even. We have a comb for this. It's wooden, with a handle made of mother of pearl that catches the light when you turn it a certain way. It belonged to Renata. Using it every morning is the one thing in 7 years I have not been able to stop doing and have never wanted to. Renata Webb died the day Aaliyah was born. She went into labor on a Tuesday morning in October. We were at the hospital by 7 a.m. By 9 o'clock, something had gone wrong that I still do not have full language for, all these years later. I walked out of that hospital at noon with a daughter in a car seat and a parking receipt in my pocket, and I have spent 7 years learning how to carry both of those things at the same time without dropping either one. What I want you to understand is that I did not fall apart. I did not get swallowed by grief and lose track of the child who needed me. I got up every morning and I learned her hair and I made her breakfast and I went to work and I came home and I got up again. What I did do, and I understand this clearly now in a way I did not understand it for most of those 7 years, was build a box around Renata, her letters, her jewelry, a photograph from the maternity session we did 2 weeks before Aaliyah arrived, and the blue pullover Renata was wearing the night I asked her to marry me in the parking lot of a Waffle House at 11 at night, because I hadn't planned it and I couldn't wait any longer. All of it went into a cardboard box. The box went up on the highest shelf of the bathroom cabinet behind the extra towels, and I told myself that keeping it up there was how I kept her safe. 3 weeks before the Caldwell Invitational, I was in the garage working on a timing belt when Aaliyah came around the side door carrying the cardboard box in both arms, holding it the careful way she holds things she's decided are important. She had climbed up on the toilet tank, reached the top shelf, and brought it to me. She set it on the workbench without a word, right next to the socket wrench I'd been using, and she looked at me with the particular expression she has when she already knows the answer to a question, but is waiting to find out if I'll tell the truth. Inside was the photograph from the maternity session. Renata looking at the camera with both hands resting on her stomach, smiling like someone who has decided to be happy no matter what comes next. Aaliyah had been holding that photograph. She set it down in front of me and asked me who that woman was, and my voice didn't come. I stood there in the garage with the smell of grease and October cold and the bare bulb swinging slightly, and not a single word came out of my mouth for a full minute. I told her, "That's your mama." 4 words. That was all I got out before I had to put the socket wrench down and look at the ceiling until the feeling in my throat passed. Aaliyah looked at the photograph for a long moment. She didn't cry. She picked it back up, carried it inside, and that evening I found her standing in front of the bathroom mirror with the photo in one hand, studying her own face. She was comparing, looking for the shape of the nose, the angle of the jaw, some evidence that she came from somewhere specific and real and beautiful. She didn't ask me if she looked like her mother. She had already understood, at 7 years old, that the question would cost me something, and she had decided not to charge me for it. I stood in that doorway and watched her for what felt like 10 minutes and was probably 2, and what moved through me in that moment was not grief exactly. It was something closer to shame. Like the thing I had been protecting all this time was not her at all. I accepted the Caldwell contract 2 days later. Aaliyah's adenoid surgery was scheduled for 5 weeks out. The doctor had flagged it 8 months earlier as necessary and not optional. Insurance covered a portion. The rest was a number I had been working toward, slowly, and the contract fee from the event would close the gap, and then some. That was the math. That was why I loaded my tool chest into the truck on a Thursday morning and drove 45 minutes north. The Caldwell Invitational happens once a year at a private estate in Alpharetta, the kind of property that has a name on a brass plate at the entrance gate, though I have never learned whose name it is or what it means. The main building is a converted carriage house with marble floors and climate-controlled lighting that makes every car in the room look like it belongs behind museum glass. There were 11 vehicles at this particular event: restoration pieces, limited editions, 2 genuine classics. I was the only outside mechanic on site, brought in specifically by the host, a man named Patterson, who had used my work before and knew I didn't make noise. My job was to be available in case something needed attention during the event. Otherwise, I was to stay near the service entrance at the back of the hall, which suited me exactly. I set up my kit, leaned my back against the wall, and watched the room fill with people who wore their money the way some people wear strong cologne. You encountered it before you saw them, and it stayed in the room after they moved on. Rebecca Ashworth arrived at 11:15 with 2 men I later learned were among the suitors her inner circle had been quietly promoting since her husband passed 3 years before. She was wearing something dark and clean that probably cost more than my truck, and she moved through the room the way certain people move through spaces they have claimed without purchasing them. Not aggressive about it, not performing, simply entirely without doubt. She did not look at the cars the way the collectors did. She looked at the people, the way a person looks when they are managing a room rather than enjoying one. She greeted the host, turned to the 2 men beside her, and then did what every other person of her income level in that room had been doing since I arrived. She looked through me without registering that there was a person there to see. Not hostility. Something more efficient than hostility. I was part of the background, in the same category as the folding equipment table and the secondary lighting rigs, and she had already moved on before her gaze fully landed. Noah had been placed near the back of the hall with a chair and a tablet, the kind of arrangement that communicates we brought the child because the alternative was harder, not because this is a space for children. He sat for about 20 minutes with the screen in his lap, but I noticed he kept looking up, not at the cars, at the people around the cars. He was watching the way his mother moved through the room, the way the men around her moved, the specific choreography that rooms like this require from everyone in them, and something about what he observed was making him smaller. I recognized that look. I had seen it every morning for 3 weeks on a 7-year-old girl at a bathroom mirror. The face of a child who is looking for something they do not yet have a word for. He got up from the chair without any announcement, walked past 3 of the suitors competing for his mother's attention, walked past a man in a gray suit who reached a hand toward him, and came directly to where I was standing near the back wall and put his hand in mine. No preamble, no greeting, no question asked. He just held on, the way children hold the hand of whoever they trust most in a room, which means firmly and without any apology for it. He looked up at me. I looked down at him. He said, "Your hands smell like a garage." I said, "That's because I work in one." He thought about that for a moment and said he liked it. Rebecca arrived in front of us approximately 30 seconds later. She did not raise her voice. I want to be clear about that. She was not theatrical about any of it. She simply took Noah's other hand with a grip that said everything it needed to say, and she looked at me with the expression of a woman who is deciding whether to speak and has calculated that speaking will cost more time than she has. She said, "Noah, come with me." Noah looked from her face to mine and back, then let go of my hand because he was 6 years old and she was his mother. And those 2 facts outweigh everything else at 6. I nodded once. The kind of nod a man gives when he has been in that position before and knows exactly how it resolves. I watched her steer him back toward the center of the room, and I did not feel diminished by it. I had been invisible in rooms like that before. It was a familiar kind of geography. That evening, while I was packing up my kit after the event cleared, Patterson found me near the service door and said there was a situation. "A woman at the event," he said. He said her name in the way people say certain names, with a pause underneath that signals the name carries its own weight, had a vehicle that needed attention. A 1965 Aston Martin DB5, he said. It had belonged to her late husband. 3 specialists had been contracted over the past 14 months. None of them had resolved the problem. She was asking about available contractors. He told me the fee she was offering for 2 weeks of work, and I did the math in my head in about the time it takes to blink. That number, combined with what I had already set aside, covered Aaliyah's surgery with room to spare. I told Patterson I was available. The paperwork arrived the next morning through a lawyer's office. 2 pages, clean, specific, with a start date, an end date, and a fee structure that did not invite negotiation. I signed it and drove north. A man named Gerald managed the Ashworth estate. He met me at the property gate, walked me to the private garage at the far side of the grounds, and handed me a folder containing the notes from all 3 previous mechanics. He told me the deadline was firm, pointed to where the outlets were, told me there was a bathroom at the end of the corridor, and left without offering me anything to drink. I pulled the cloth cover off the DB5. It was dark blue, close enough to black that in low light you couldn't tell the difference, with the original leather interior in a condition that told you someone had cared about this car for a long time. Not just maintained it, but cared about it the way you care about something you are planning to finish and hand down. I read through the notes from the previous 3 mechanics. They had all gone after the same symptoms. I set the folder aside, pulled up a folding chair, turned on the work light, and sat down in front of the open hood to listen. The first 3 days, I did not touch the engine. On the second morning, Gerald stopped by to check in and found me in the chair with a flashlight and a notepad, and he asked if there was a problem. I told him there wasn't. I was listening. He gave me the look people give when they aren't sure if you're a craftsman or a fraud, and then he left. But that is how I have always worked. Ever since my father first showed me how to approach a car someone else has already gotten wrong. A machine that has been mishandled 3 times is going to be full of compensations, small corrections made to chase a symptom that nobody understood, layered on top of each other, until what you're looking at has no relationship to what the original problem actually was. You go in swinging on day 1, and you spend the rest of your time chasing the previous mechanics instead of the engine. So, I sat. I let the car talk. I listened to the tick of the cooling metal, the particular silence of something that has been stopped mid-sentence by someone who didn't know what it was trying to say. On the 4th day I found it. The 3 mechanics before me had all locked onto the fuel delivery. There was a symptom in the carburetor that pointed hard in that direction, and I understood exactly why they went there. But it was wrong. The real problem was older than that, and further back, a hairline compromise at a head gasket junction that had been corrupting every downstream reading for years, masking the actual fuel behavior and making the carburetor behave in ways that had nothing to do with the carburetor. I had seen something similar exactly once before, on a 1962 Mercedes my uncle had brought to my father's shop when I was about 16. My father spent 4 days on it before he saw what he was looking at, and I remembered it because he sat me down and walked me through the entire chain of misreadings afterward, like a lesson. I had that memory in my hands as clearly as if I was 16 again, and he was standing 2 feet to my left. The fix was not quick, but it was possible, and it was knowable, and it was mine. I wrote it out on the notepad, closed the hood gently, and sat back in the folding chair, and the feeling I had was not pride. It was something quieter and cleaner than that, something that only comes from doing the work the way it was supposed to be done. That same evening, I called Aaliyah from the garage. She answered on the 2nd ring and said, "Hi, Daddy," in a voice that was noticeably smaller than her usual voice, and something shifted in my chest the moment I heard it. I asked how school was. She said fine, which is the word she uses when it isn't. I asked what she had for dinner, and she said Ms. Everett brought over chicken, which told me she had spent the afternoon next door, which meant she hadn't wanted to be alone in the house. I told her I'd be home by the weekend. She said, okay. She didn't say anything about the mirror. She didn't ask about the comb. She said she loved me, and the line went quiet. And I sat in that garage in the particular silence of someone who is far away from the person they should be next to, holding a phone that had already gone still. On the Thursday of that week, I left the estate early and drove to Alia's school for afternoon pickup. Her teacher, Mrs. Okafor, stepped out to the car line and asked if I had a moment to speak. She told me she had noticed a change over the past few weeks, that Alia had stopped engaging during recess, had started sitting by the back fence alone, not talking to the other children, not joining anything. She was not in trouble, Mrs. Okafor said that plainly, and she meant it. But the quiet was new in a way that the teacher wanted me to know about. I thanked her. I walked to the car. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine for what was probably longer than I realized, and then Alia came through the school door with her backpack and climbed in and buckled her seatbelt and tilted her head at me and asked why we weren't moving. And I looked at her face in the afternoon October light, the shape of the jaw, the angle of the cheekbones, all of Renata laid out in front of me in miniature, and I understood clearly and completely what I needed to do that night. I started the car, and I drove home without the radio on. I put Alia's dinner on the table, and after she ate and washed up, I went to the bathroom cabinet and took down the box. I carried it into her room and set it on the floor and sat down beside it, and I said, "Come sit with me for a minute." She climbed down from her bed and sat across from me with her legs crossed, the way she always sits when she knows something is happening that deserves her full attention. I opened the box in front of her. I took out the photograph first and laid it between us on the floor, and I said that woman's name was Renata, and she was your mama, and she loved you before she ever saw your face. I told her about the night her mother laughed so hard at something her cousin said that she fell clean off the back step and sat in the yard laughing harder. I told her about the way Renata hummed when she was reading, low and under her breath, without knowing she was doing it, just a sound that meant she was comfortable. I took out the earrings next, small gold hoops with a tiny hinge clasp. I told her these were what her mother wore on their first date, to a restaurant where the menus had no prices, which Renata thought was ridiculous, and said so out loud to the waiter, which was when I knew she was the one. I took out the pullover, the blue one, soft from washing, with a small loose thread at one cuff, and I told her this was what her mother was wearing the night I asked her to marry me, standing in the parking lot of a Waffle House at 11 at night because I had not planned it and suddenly could not wait one more day. I put the pullover in Alia's lap. She held it there with both hands without moving. I took out the comb last, and I set it beside the photograph, and I didn't say anything about the comb because she already knew what the comb was and where it came from. She held the pullover and looked at the photograph, and I sat with her in all of it and let it be what it was, and it was the most honest thing I had done in 7 years. She asked me, after a silence that lasted long enough to feel like its own thing, if she looked like her, and I told her yes. I told her yes, she did, very much, and this time the words came out whole. It was on the 8th evening of the contract, past 10 o'clock, that Rebecca Ashworth came into the garage alone. She was wearing a coat over what looked like clothes she'd had on around the house, and she came through the side door and stood at the edge of the work light and asked where things stood with the timeline. I told her I was on schedule. She looked at the car for a moment, and then she asked what had been wrong that the 3 previous mechanics had missed. I told her, briefly and without embellishment. She went quiet. And then she asked a follow-up question that was not a polite question. It was a real one, the kind people ask when they actually want to understand the answer, not just when they want to appear as if they're paying attention. I answered it. She listened, standing in that doorway in her coat, and she stayed there in the light from the work lamp for longer than a status check required. Then she left. She did not ask again about the timeline for the next 3 days. That was the first time I noticed that something behind the surface of her was paying a different kind of attention. Now, here is where I want to ask you something, because I have been thinking about this part of the story for a long time. At this point, I had found what 3 specialists had missed. I had opened a box I had kept sealed for 7 years and sat on the floor with my daughter and told her the truth about where she came from. And I had a woman who had looked through me like furniture now showing up at 10 at night, asking questions she actually wanted the answers to. Tell me what you think happens next. Leave it in the comments below, because I can promise you that where this goes from here is not the direction most people expect. On the 12th day, Rebecca came to the garage in the late morning, and she brought Noah with her. He came through the side door ahead of her, saw me immediately, and crossed the garage directly, the same way he had crossed the marble hall 3 weeks before. He asked if I was still fixing his dad's car. I said I was, almost done. He asked if he could see the engine, and I looked at Rebecca. She gave me one slow nod. I pulled a stool over to the open engine bay and let him stand on it and look down into it. He examined it with the serious focus of someone who has decided this is worth his full attention, and then he asked me a question that none of the adults in that garage over 12 days had thought to ask. What does it smell like when a car smells wrong? I told him it smells like something trying too hard. He turned that over in his mind, and then he turned around on the stool and looked at his mother and said, "Mama, did Dad ever get to drive it?" And the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with anything I did. Rebecca's face did not break. It did something more precise than that. A stillness moved through it, the kind that comes not from having no feeling, but from 3 years of practice in knowing exactly where to put your feelings so they don't touch the things you cannot afford to have touched. She said he drove it once before it stopped working. Her voice was level. Noah nodded the way he nods when he's filing something. Then, without turning around from the engine bay, he said, "Does your dad like cars too?" And I said my father taught me the name of every tool in his shop before he taught me the alphabet. He passed when I was 22, and I still reach for the phone sometimes when I find something he would have liked. Noah said, "Oh," and nodded again. Then he climbed down from the stool and asked if he could sit in the driver's seat. I walked him around, opened the door, and he settled into the seat and put both hands on the wheel and stared straight ahead at the closed garage door with the look of someone who knows exactly where they are going and is simply waiting for the road to start. Rebecca had moved from the doorway to just inside the garage. I did not look directly at her, but I felt the particular quality of someone who is watching something they did not prepare themselves to feel. She left with Noah 10 minutes after that. I went back to the engine. About an hour later, I heard the side door again. She came back in alone. She stood inside the garage this time, not at the door, and she said, "I want to ask you something, and I'd like a real answer." I set down what I was holding, and I said, "All right." She asked what happened to Aliyah's mother. I told her. I told her Renata's name. I told her about the Tuesday morning in October, the drive to the hospital at 7, the specific speed with which everything fell apart before noon. I told her about the parking receipt still in my coat pocket when I drove home alone. I told her about Aliyah's eyes in the afternoon light 3 weeks ago, standing at the mirror with the photograph in her hand, looking for evidence that she came from something real. I did not soften any of it. She had asked a real question, and she deserved a real answer. Then she told me about James, not the businessman. The man who put notes in her shoes at night so she found them in the morning when she got dressed. Not elaborate, just small proof that he had been paying attention to something she hadn't mentioned out loud. The man who stayed awake through 2 nights straight when she had pneumonia and never once said he was tired, who had bought the DB5 as a project in the last 2 years of his life, who worked on it in this garage on weekends with a level of focus she had never seen him bring to anything except his family, and who made her promise in the last month of his life that she would see it finished and give it to Noah when Noah was old enough to understand what it had meant. She had folded her arms around herself as she talked, not from cold, and at some point in the middle of it, she stopped looking at the space between us and started looking at me. I did not fill the silence when she ran out of words. I let it be the size it needed to be. What I understood in that garage, sitting on my stool with the engine cooling between us, was something I had been circling for a long time without landing on it. She had built her armor the same way I had built my box. She had sealed James inside the careful management of everything he left behind, the property, the fund, the lineup of suitable men she evaluated from behind a careful distance, because a man who needs nothing from you can never take anything from you either. The suitors were her version of the box on the high shelf. Keep the lid on, and the grief stays contained. Keep the distance wide, and nothing can get through to hurt you again. But grief is patient in a way that we never quite account for. It will wait inside a cardboard box on a high shelf or inside an unfinished engine in a private garage until someone honest enough and young enough and uncalculating enough to not know the rules decides to come find it. In Noah's case, that someone walked across a marble floor and grabbed my hand. In Aaliyah's case, that someone climbed up on a toilet tank and brought me a box. I said none of that out loud. What I did was shift my stool back against the fender of the DB5 and sit down with my back to the car. She looked at the empty space for a moment. Then she pulled the chair that Gerald kept near the wall, and she sat on the other side of the hood, and the two of us stayed there on either side of that car while the light through the high garage windows went from white to gold to gray, not talking, not touching, not explaining anything. Two people who had lost the center of their lives from different directions, sitting in the same room, finally in the same place. The engine was almost finished. Another day, and it would be ready. And for the first time since I had pulled the cover off this car, what I felt about finishing it was not urgency. It was something closer to gratitude. I finished the engine on the morning of the 14th day. I turned the key, and the DB5 came back to life on the first try. That sound a restored engine makes when everything is finally where it was built to be. Not mechanical exactly, more like something that has been holding its breath for a long time and is finally allowed to let it out. I sat in the driver's seat and listened to it for a full minute. I thought about James Ashworth, whom I never met, who had cared about this car enough to make his wife promise not to let it stay broken. I thought about my father's name scratched into a tool chest 45 minutes south of here. Then I got out, cleaned my hands, folded the cloth cover, and called Gerald to let him know the job was done. Rebecca came to the garage that afternoon with Noah. I walked her through the engine, what I had found, what had been wrong, what I changed, and why. Not to demonstrate anything, because she deserved to know the full story of her husband's car. She listened to everything. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said she wanted to offer an additional payment. She named a number, significantly more than the contract. She said it was for the expertise, for the time, for finding what others had missed. I said no. She said she was serious. I said I understood that, and the answer was still no. She looked at me for a moment, the way people look when they are trying to determine the difference between being refused and being respected, and I let her look until she arrived at the right answer. Noah asked if he could go around the block. Rebecca looked at the car, and then at Noah, and then at me, and she said yes. We drove one slow loop around the block in Alpharetta with Noah in the passenger seat, his arm out the window into the October air, his hand cupped like a wing, calling out the names of streets as we passed them as though he was naming them himself for the first time. He was laughing, the kind of laugh that comes from a child who is genuinely happy and doesn't know they're supposed to manage it. I kept my eyes on the road, but as I pulled back into the estate driveway and cut the engine, I heard Rebecca say something from where she was standing near the gate. quiet, not directed at me, aimed at the air or at whoever she still talked to when she thought nobody was listening. It sounded like "Thank you, James." The following Saturday, I was in the garage at home working through an afternoon job when I heard the side door and then the sound of 2 sets of feet, one heavier, one lighter. Aaliyah came in first, and then Noah, and behind them, at the end of the driveway, stopped at the gate, was Rebecca. She had driven them over without calling first, which I understood immediately was the hardest part of the morning for her. Noah had something in his hands, a sheet of paper folded carefully in half, held out toward Aaliyah with the serious intentionality of someone delivering something that matters. It was a drawing. 2 cars, one larger and one small, with Aaliyah and Noah written in large uneven letters underneath, the spelling approximate, the effort enormous. Aaliyah took it with both hands and looked at it for a long moment. Then she reached over to the workbench and picked up the mother-of-pearl comb and held it out to Noah. She placed it in his hands and let him hold it while she counted, quietly, to 5, not giving it, letting him touch it, letting him know it existed, and that she had decided he was someone it was all right to show. Noah looked at it carefully and handed it back with a gentleness that told you he understood it mattered, even without knowing why. Children understand that about objects. They usually know which things are sacred long before they know the word. I watched Aaliyah tuck the comb into the top pocket of her overalls and look at the drawing one more time and fold it carefully in half along the same crease Noah had made. And I thought about the box that was no longer on the high shelf in the bathroom cabinet. It was on the windowsill of Aaliyah's room now, with the photograph propped against the wall and the earrings in a small clay dish she had made at school in 2nd grade. The pullover was folded on the chair beside her bed. Renata was not sealed away anymore. She was present in the room, the way someone is present when they are part of how you live every day, not a grief you manage, but a person you carry. Aaliyah had stopped standing at the mirror, not because she had found what she was looking for and finished looking, but because she understood now that she had always already had it. It had been in her face every morning. She had just needed someone to say so out loud. Rebecca and I are not a finished story. I want to be honest with you about that, because I don't believe in endings that tie themselves up so neatly they stop being real. What we are is 2 people who stood on either side of a driveway gate on a Saturday morning in November, watching our children exchange a drawing and a comb, and looked at each other without armor for the first time. She asked if she could bring Noah back sometime. I said yes. That was all. There is something between us that neither of us has named yet, and neither of us is in a hurry to. And I have come to believe that there is real dignity in letting something be what it is before you decide what it will be. The crack in the garage floor is still there. My father's name is still on the tool chest. But Aaliyah smiles in the mornings now with a completeness she didn't have before, and the comb goes through her hair slow and easy. And sometimes when I finish her part, she pats my hand once. Quick, just once, like she wants me to know she's all right. And I think about what I was keeping sealed in that box on the high shelf, and I think about what came in the moment I finally opened it. And I think that maybe the bravest thing I ever did had nothing to do with a car or a contract or a room full of men who looked through me. It was sitting down on a bedroom floor with a box between me and my daughter and finally telling her the truth. Here is the question I keep coming back to, and I think somewhere in yourself you know it too. What have you been keeping sealed because you told yourself it was safer that way? What have you convinced yourself you were protecting when what you were really protecting was just the grief itself, keeping it comfortable, keeping it still, keeping it from having to go anywhere or become anything? I don't have your answer, but I know what mine cost me, and I know what it gave back. If this story stayed with you, leave me something in the comments. Tell me what it brought up. Tell me what you recognized in it. because that conversation is the whole reason I'm here. Hit the like button if you made it all the way through. It matters more than you know. And come back next week, because the next story is about a man who was told, by everyone who was supposed to believe in him, that he would never be enough. And the one person who proved every single word of that wrong. I will see you there.